Hello, hello, and welcome to Strictly Speaking. My name is Joshua Reaves. I am the director of University Theater here at NC State. And tonight, our guest is a Houston based acoustics consultant with nearly 20 years of experience in performing arts related venues and academic facilities, Anthony SHOU. Anthony, welcome to the show.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Thanks, Anthony. And to go ahead and get it kicked off, Anthony, I'm going to ask you the first question we ask everyone here on Strictly Speaking. What is it? What is it that a acoustics consultant does? What does that mean to you?
For me, it's specialty consulting that's got to do anything with sound, anything related to sound in the built environment. So whether it's a theater space, whether it's a concert hall, a classroom, a restaurant, hospital, anywhere where there's sound matters, an acoustical consultant could be involved to deal with room acoustics. So that's kind of what you hear in terms of reflections off surfaces or things being absorbed. Sound isolation is another huge thing that we do. Making sure that you get the privacy or you don't have any intrusions of sound from if you're designing a theater from outside sources. Noise control, so what you don't hear. So you don't want to hear mechanical noise roaring away. That's just making it more difficult for people to connect. And then there's also kind of the aspect of the audio visual systems. So it's all about making human connections stronger. So that's kind of what I see my role, my job on a day-to-day is being that as an acoustical consultant, touch all those things.
Awesome, thank you. And your resume and your information states that you focus in on performing art spaces and higher education spaces, but I heard you mention all sorts of different places.
Mhm.
What brought you into working with higher education and with performance art spaces? What attracted you to those spaces?
That was actually quite accidental.
Okay.
I was interested in acoustics mainly because Larry Kierkegaard, so the person who founded Kierkegaard Associates and now just Kierkegaard, came to our school to give a lecture. And I was like, wow, that's kind of interesting. Something like science and architecture. I wonder what it would be like if I get an internship there. So I didn't realize that the firm specialized in, performing arts. So it was just kind of stumbled right into it. And then I was doing that for like 13 some years. And then I moved down to Houston and I was trying to think through, well, there's probably more to acoustics than just building theaters and concert halls. I guess I had too good of a thing running. So I thought acoustics could be interesting if we think about it from a broader perspective. How can we kind of think about applying what I've learned, things that I've used in kind of performance space design to improve everyone's experience, right? So my new thing here is more about acoustics for everyone. So that's why it's the broader kind of spread of different sector work.
I see. Okay. And do you work in, I mean, like you mentioned other spaces, are there spaces that you've worked in that that differ very much from your performance arts or your higher education spaces?
Yeah, I think the areas that we touch upon is like we even do multifamily work. So
Oh,
this is, making sure, or dormitories, for instance, I would say fall into that kind of category where it's kind
mhm.
of multifamily or residential single occupancy type spaces. Um, Even those spaces need good acoustics, mostly good sound isolation
I see.
is what it's about. In commercial projects, we work on a lot of offices. Building out offices as well as kind of building the office tower, making sure that when you build a core and shell of an office tower, that the basic mechanical systems are going to be quiet. So whichever tenant moves in and decide to build it out, customize it for themselves, have a good chance at having low background noise levels. Um, so those are kind of different project types that for me, it seems, you know, well, why would you choose doing performing arts and move on to doing commercial stuff?
Oh, I
It's like,
see.
because it's different, it's fun.
Yeah.
And, you work with different architects, work with different clients, different interests. And I guess I'm just interested in helping everyone out. And it keeps me on my on my feet to just kind of stay in balance. And sometimes, the ideas or concepts in a corporate design environment, I've seen it go across to kind of the educational settings,
Hmm.
seeing a lot more instead of private offices, shared office spaces, huddle rooms. So those were kind of design ideas that came from, in my brain, the corporate world and how they kind of create spaces and experiences that I see a lot in newer buildings and the higher ed side of things. So I really enjoyed then also the cross pollination of different ideas, stuff in performing arts, kind of finding a thread and say, hey, here's a good application in a hospital lobby. You never know. So,
Yeah, and especially nowadays when we need that sound isolation inside our own rooms, especially
mhm.
for this type of environment. These Zoom conferences, my children are constantly running upstairs. What I do wonder, like, how do you go about deciding or figuring out how a room is going to sound before it's even built? Like, what's involved in that process?
So there's a lot of modeling tools that we can rely on these days. Some that helps with understanding the degree of sound isolation that you can achieve. Others that help you kind of almost create a sound or oral experience of what a room would sound like or a recital hall would sound like. So there's a lot of tools have been developed that allow people who are less familiar with sound but is trying to achieve the best experience, that then relies on the acoustical consultant to come up with simulations on, so okay, here, if you want X level of speech privacy, then we really encourage you to think about building a wall that looks like this. And then also then have a moderate amount of background noise so that any bleed that does go through is not immediately heard if the room was completely silent on the other side. So there's a lot of this kind of balancing things that we're looking at and utilizing tools to really understand, whether this wall needs to be, a traditional, very thin wall that you find in your house where you can, hear your kids, or it needs to be something else more than that. Like you have a recording studio in your house and you have kids. So, let's try to do recording simultaneous of people running around. How do you do that? Well, then that requires different set of construction techniques to achieve
I see. Well, if I can get you up here to help me out, that would be great because
that.
my son, he sounds like he sounds like an elephant up the stairs all day long. And so I'm interested, not to get too much in the weeds, but I'm interested in knowing, is it more about the materials that are used or the application of those materials that really helps, or is it a combination of both?
It's really a combination of both. I mean, I think most people can relate to kind of their homes being wood structures. And if you live in a wood structure building, and you're upstairs and downstairs, it's very easy to hear what's going on, because wood conducts sound energy really, really well. So even a little kid running around, in fact, they seem to be the loudest. Um, I guess adults have known to walk to be more considerate, right? And
Oh,
but since it's all stuck together, any sort of sound, once it's in the structure, you can almost hear it anywhere in your house, unless you live in a really, really, really big house. So there's some fundamental kind of connections to the building material that then also impacts how much performance you will get in terms of the isolation you're able to achieve. Right. So generally, lighter materials or stiffer materials like wood really kind of carry the sound and the energy into the structure, and then it radiates out into another space. If you built your home out of concrete, for instance, much more massive, much more dense, um, and that will be better in terms of reducing the amount of that energy transfer that goes around, and that you will hear less impact noise from above, for instance, or even less speech or music.
mm,
So it really kind of the materiality we in our field, we decide based on the use of the room. So for instance, if it's just speech isolation, you might get away with using thinner, more typical, drywall that you see at the big box stores, right? Put it on some studs and put some insulation in, and you're good for speech isolation. But if you want to build something that is able to isolate music, then maybe you start thinking about multiple layers of drywall. Maybe you throw in some concrete masonry units in there just to have some more mass to deal with the lower frequencies.
I
That
see.
So it's all about the science of materials and how they perform and knowing the right combinations to kind of achieve the right level. Because one of the things is that if, you know, all the stuff that I described, it could get really complicated. The wall could go from something that's 6 inches
Hmm.
to 2 to 3 feet.
Oh,
And
wow.
you can't be building 2 to 3 foot thick walls everywhere because you end up with not enough usable space and it costs so much money, right? And
Hmm.
our job then is to help the architect, the engineers, the owners and users find out what is the, most efficient wall buildup that
Hmm.
is most cost effective. So we're not wasting a whole bunch of money. Because in my field, if you put a lot of money in the sound isolation, there may not be enough left for the room acoustic treatments or the audio video systems if we're all kind of talking about the disciplines of things that we
Gotcha.
do. So it's a balancing act.
Okay, great. And I want to, I want to put a pin in the because I want to come back to the room, modifications once the space is built.
Mhm.
But you've mentioned material sciences, you mentioned architecture, you mentioned structural analysis. What is your background? And you know, I'm not seeing much in the way of acoustical a consultant uh, majors. Like, what is it? What does it take to become and to go into a field like yours?
That's interesting. Well, these days it is easier to get into the field of acoustic consulting because there's actually universities that offer undergrad kind of focused training in this area. And there's actually graduate programs that
Oh,
allows you
I'm
to kind
sorry.
of, no.
I'll do my research.
It's not everywhere. It's not everywhere.
Yeah.
Not all universities have it,
Hmm.
but there are a few. So it's easier to get in to this field if you kind of realize early on that this is something that you want to do and pursue as a career. Now, the way I got into it is actually quite unusual. My undergraduate degree is in biology. So for a good part of my life, I was thinking, well, I'm going to be a doctor because that's what my family came from Taiwan. And when you have folks that come over and you have Asian parents, you know, I think the expectations were you should be a doctor, a lawyer, or engineer, something that you can make big money and do well. And so that's was my focus for the early part of my life. So I studied biology. Um, I didn't go to medical school, but the one thing that I realized that the creative side of me that I've been kind of putting aside because due to my focus and kind of the pursuit of medicine was kind of I like to draw. I like to think about things in 3 dimension. I like music. I just never really explored it because I was so obsessed about being a doctor. So um, there was a time in my career where or academic career where everyone is trying to get into med school, and I have friends now who have a master's of public health, they have a doctor, or I have friends that are MD PhDs, right?
Hmm.
And I figure if I stuck around long enough, I could have, I guess, been a medical doctor, but I'm glad I didn't
Yeah.
because I really enjoy what I'm doing. So during that time where I was applying to med school and wasn't getting in, I was like, what else can I do? It's like, well, I could draw. Let's apply to architecture school because, I don't know about being an artist and how much money you make being an artist and how that would mean to my family. So, well, architecture, that's a profession. So that's how I got into architecture school, and uh, I applied to so many, and I got in. So I thought, well, this must be a sign. Couldn't get into medical school, and I got into architecture school. Um, and I mentioned earlier, I heard a lecture about acoustics,
Uh-huh.
and I was like, wow, you're supposed to do internships as an architect. I never really thought about that. So let's call up Kierkegaard and see if they will accept me as a summer intern. Um, so that's my kind of door into the
Yeah.
world of acoustics. And I originally just thought that maybe I would do acoustic consulting for a couple years because all my other friends from grad school are all architects. Or I have doctor friends and I have architects, and I'm neither. Um, but I think my original plan was know sound and how sound behaves,
Hmm.
and so I could become a better architect.
I see.
About 10 years into my career as an acoustic consultant, an architect and I were having dinner, and I was sharing my aspirations of still like passing the architectural registration exam and becoming an architect. And he just flat out asked me like, why?
Mm,
So you seem pretty good at what you do. And that's what the light bulb went off. It's like, wait a second. So the second half of my career, almost 2 decades, has been more focused on really kind of just committing to the field of acoustics, which I really enjoy, and focusing on that. And that's kind of the long way of how I got
I see.
here.
Yeah.
Um, but I was going to offer that while there are degree programs that can get you into this field much quicker,
Mhm.
if I had to do it all over again, I probably would have gone through all the steps just
I see.
because the experiences were interesting. Um, and I wouldn't I wouldn't do it a different way. So maybe just follow what your interests are.
Awesome.
And if it comes to across to the acoustic consulting, I learned everything on the job. Uh, but
Well,
still
thank you.
possible.
And I didn't mean to, it certainly didn't mean any disrespect to the field. It just, I know that there's so much involved in this that it seems like there's a lot of on the job training, as you were saying.
It
Um,
absolutely is. Yeah.
and at what point in the process, the construction process for, let's say, new construction,
hmm
are acoustical consultants brought in to consult on the actual project?
I would say that depending on the complexity of the project and what the end goals are, sometimes the best time to bring it on is in the very beginning. So, uh, right when you're thinking about hiring an architect, you should be thinking about hiring an acoustical consultant. And so that will have the best result because acoustics then is planned into the project rather than potentially afterthought, right? So if it comes in very late in design where they're documenting everything, then ready, getting the drawings and specifications ready to go out to bid for contractors to price into the build. If you're trying to insert acoustic elements, we can still pull it off, but it's sometimes more challenging, right? Because you can't do something that you could have done
It's more
half a year
expensive.
ago and it's more expensive too.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I would always say that, at least ask the acoustic consultant to kind of weigh in and say, hey, is this something that we really need you at this point? Or is this something that we can wait a little later until things settle down on the kind of the building layout? Then you come in and help us improve sound isolation, work on the room acoustics and such. So it really depends on the project, but for art spaces or performing art spaces where sound isolation and all those other kind of systems have to be really dialed in,
Mhm.
um, uh, start as early as possible. And then we go through the whole design phases with the architectural team. We're also involved during construction because a lot of the assemblies that I discussed earlier are sometimes very unusual,
Mm,
even to the contractors who are building it. They may not have encountered something quite like that before. So being on site during construction to make sure that the design gets implemented,
I see.
um, following our design intent is also very important. And then even afterwards, when the whole building's done, um, what we do is so unusual. So that most people don't know, what is your, okay, so I just go in here and listen or play and this is what it is. And it's like, oh no, we actually planned some adjustability for you. So here's what you can do for, if you're thinking about doing X, and here's another setting if you want to do Y. Is to then help the user groups actually acclimate and understand kind of some of the how the room works from a science point of view, and then they can kind of go in there and experiment and find what's the best room setting that they feel most comfortable in. So
Okay.
yeah,
Yeah.
so pretty much from the very beginning to the very end.
Gotcha. Yeah.
Yeah.
Last week we had a lighting consultant on, and
Mhm.
they talked about how the theater space, the concert hall, was actually physically isolated from the rest of the building. Um,
Yes.
that was pretty interesting. Have you done something like that? And if so, could you speak about what that means?
Yeah. So this is where acoustics for performing arts spaces gets super complicated. I think what you're referring to is essentially if you have a very important space that you want to be free from potential disruptions from the lobby space or adjacent venue. Let's say there's a theater next to it or a black
Mhm.
box
Yep,
next to
that was
it.
the case. Yeah.
And you want it to be used simultaneously. at a very high level. The background noise is super low because if you're doing a concert hall, yeah, it's super quiet. So you need massive isolation. I think what's probably done in that particular project is that they build the concert hall or the performance space as its own separate, essentially building and structure,
Yeah.
and wrapped everything else around it, right?
Hmm.
And that is one of the most extreme ways of achieving good sound isolation. Essentially, is to build a building within a building. Um, it's very complex and it's very expensive because you're building things superstructure that has to go around a very large venue. Um,
Yeah,
but
that's exactly how he put it. He said it was a building built inside a building. I believe
building,
he was speaking about the Duke Performing Arts space, or somewhere on Duke campus,
okay,
that they had done just that to separate their dance recital hall from their concert hall, which was
exactly, yep.
pretty interesting.
Hmm. Yeah, usually this is could be pretty extreme. So it could be, having two important venues that you want to isolate, then that's why you would create, two separate buildings.
Wow.
Or if you have, let's say, a large roadhouse, a concert hall, and then a small proscenium theater, you might implement that kind of concept, three times.
Oh,
So
wow.
you have three buildings under one big roof.
And you've worked on you had sent me some information about the Logan Center for the Arts at
Mhm.
the University of Chicago.
Right.
That was something where there was a lot of different spaces within one space.
Correct.
What are the other challenges that you find? Of course, there's isolation, but are there other challenges having so many different spaces in the same building?
Absolutely. What I kind of described, about having the large performance venues kind of all under one roof being a separate structure, you could think about that kind of horizontally, how you have three different buildings and one big roof. The Logan Center, what's interesting here is that this is a section through the tower. It's I want to say it's 11 or 12-story tower. Um, then all the different programs is kind of slotted into a tower. And you can see here, some floors are used for music, some for dance, theater. There's even a film screening room, and then some video editing stuff in the basement that I didn't mark up. But there's a lot of different uses that can occur any time of the day simultaneously. And the primary challenge is that you want to make sure that there's very little disruption from one vertical space going to the next. And you can't really build three different buildings vertically. So what we do is each of the spaces, the critical spaces, is a floating box within the larger superstructure.
Oh, wow.
So for instance, there's a floating concrete floor in the music rehearsal slash performance space, the performance penthouse at the
Mm.
top. The dance and theater spaces also have floating concrete floors. The walls that are kind of heavy masonry units are also floating. And then there's a floating ceiling inside. So there's a lot of what we call box in box
Mm.
construction that just allows then all these spaces of different user groups to use simultaneously, and no one's going to get mad at another. It's like, hey, our students, you guys are moving your tables around too much, and we can hear the chair scraping and the table scraping and the theater space.
Mm.
We just kind of built that all into kind of consideration from day one, and planned accordingly. So you do see that if you wouldn't mind going back to the section again.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
And
Oops.
here we go.
Okay. Um, One of the strategies that we did is that you see there's some white space below the purple music performance. So that is a general arts classroom that is probably less sensitive compared to, let's say, a dance studio or a theater. Yeah, there you go. Oh, perfect. Yeah, so those are general art classrooms. So we purposely slotted them in between as buffer spaces. So that's one of
Ah,
the concepts of, instead of spending so much money and making this so expensive and making the building even taller because of all the different layers that you have to build in. Sometimes the easiest way is to put in spaces that are, okay for a little bit of
yeah,
noise intrusion, right?
I see. And that's
Uh,
great. That's awesome. Yeah,
yeah,
and I did. Now that you pointed out, it's like, of course, there's all this white, multi-purpose or classroom spaces in between all these larger spaces. That's awesome.
yeah, it's like a big cake with different layers.
Awesome. Well, Rich Holly asks, with so many people needing to be on Zoom and other platforms from their home now, what are some relatively easy sound treatments they might consider using?
Hi, Rich. I think that's a good question. It's something that as an acoustician, we were criticizing our own colleagues' rooms just to make sure that we don't sound terrible as acousticians when we're joining phone calls. But simple things that would help is sound diffusive elements in the room that you're having the Zoom call in would be nice. So any sort of web conferencing, the microphone, whether it's through your headset or your computer, will pick up the general room ambiance. And so if you have room that's completely bare, very clean walls, very little furnishing, it will tend to sound more spacious and it has a boomier characteristic. My room has a fair amount of window treatment, has some shelving on the walls you can't really see, but just general clutter. I have stuff all over my desk and on the floor. All that starts to work as free diffusion, right? So you don't have to buy diffusion as a product. You could just, if you live in your space and you have stuff, I have loudspeaker gear sitting in a corner of my room, breaking up sound. That's good to kind of create a environment that's a little bit more intimate. And then I actually have a couch in the back too. So that's just fabric with a lot of sound absorptive foam. And that helps to really kind of control how much sound is sustained in the space. If you want to go aggressive with it, you can put in really plush curtains and very plush furniture, in addition to kind of the hard furnishings and clutter, and create a very controlled environment. So, and you can do this elegantly and tastefully. I just have everything piled everywhere. So it
Well, that's
works
what
for me.
you guys heard it. Anthony said you don't have to clean up. It's for acoustics.
Right.
That's why my desk is a mess. That's it. That's the only reason why.
That's right. Well, bring in a laundry basket, full of clothes. So that'll help too.
Well, yes, with with an 8 and 9 year old, I've got plenty of laundry baskets full of clothes. All
I
right.
realize what's interesting. Just if you have a closet and you're in a bedroom, open the closet door, and that's free absorption because all that clothes in there, right?
Well, that's
Can
genius.
soak up sound, right? So that makes a huge difference. So, like I said, you don't have to change the way your room looks to make it acoustically more friendly for calls.
Great. And that way I can tell my kids to hang their clothes up instead of leaving them in the baskets.
Perfect.
It's for Zoom. That's why. So, I too had spent some time in Houston. I do want to ask, how are you doing? Were you impacted by the storms down there?
Yeah, last week, I think it was last week, it felt like I'd lost weeks, during the cold spell, but I believe it was last week. A couple days we lost power. And I know there was like a state rolling power on, power off just to conserve electricity. We were probably without power for nearly 2 days straight. I know there's other areas that lost power for a shorter amount of time and others much, much longer. And I just couldn't believe that, hey, when it's 20 degrees outside in Houston, and you have no power to get your furnace going, it just got cold. So, we survived it, no power and freezing pipes. We survived that too. And food shortage a little bit, just because everything's spoiled while the power was out. And then everybody went in, try to get their water and get the food. A little bit of gas storage shortage too. Everything was just crazy. So, but we're fine.
Good.
I think generally fared probably better than most people did.
Well, good. Well, I'm glad to hear that. I just wanted, we've been thinking about you up here, and glad to hear that you're doing okay. So here's some more questions for you. Talk to us about a typical day for you. So, obviously you've got major projects that will last a long time, but what's a typical day for you? And let's try it pre-COVID while you can still visit sites and go in.
Yeah. So pre-COVID, uh, There's actually, instead of Zoom calls, there's probably driving up to an architect's office and having the whole team of engineers and just different design team members be in the same room and literally kind of coming up with a design solution for some complicated problems. Um, that's one of the very natural things. So it could be that during the day or a week, I'm visiting architectural, colleagues 3 to 4 times a week, sometimes
Oh,
more, right? And sometimes because of the work that we do, if the project is in California, we might have to fly to California. So there may be even travel,
hmm
out of state travel 1 or 2 times a week. So those are all kind of the realm of the possibility. I think as a firm, and I kind of just being critical of how we use our time, I think some of the design folks already adopted things like Zoom or GoToMeeting or WebEx, different platforms, just to see if we can cut out the travel time and
Yeah.
then communicate. But there's something about just being in the same room and being able to read people's expression. It's like, oh, Anthony just says something that the structural engineer did not like at all. And, you can see that and say, hey, maybe that's not the best solution. What are your thoughts, right? What do you think is the challenge of implementing that? It's harder to do when everybody's a little tile. Um,
Yeah,
yeah. So that was a lot of the time, is just kind of coordinating
I see.
our work with the different disciplines. There's also a lot of communicating that just happens in reports and
Mhm.
narratives that we have to write, so that can reach a lot more people at the same time if you distribute. So a lot of our time still is spent in front of computers, typing up reports, building the acoustic models to try to understand how something's going to sound, and just doing predictive modeling. So
Okay.
that was why I would say it's kind of day in and day out. There's a lot more travel. Now the travel is from the bedroom, you go downstairs.
Yes. I know that. And are there certain softwares or certain types of programs that you're using that are always open on your desktop, or is it just simply Zoom at this point?
Actually, I turned off a few things just to make sure I don't have any connectivity issues
Mm.
for our call. But you know, it's a lot of different platforms. Each
Okay.
day I go through probably at least 4 or 5 different platforms for online communicating. And,
Mhm.
that's probably what's up on my screen the most. Um, I rely on some very basic word processing, it's like Google Docs or Word documents and spreadsheets.
Mm.
Um, those are always up,
Yeah.
because sometimes you got to do a acoustic calculation. It's good to just have a spreadsheet to plug equations in and get a scientific approach to kind of answering your problem.
Yeah.
Um, so that's probably what's on my computer all the time. Um, I think the more interesting software though is the software that you could help predict how a room is going to sound
Mm.
before you build it. So there's quite a few acoustic modeling software that we can utilize that literally take a 3-dimension architectural model, and you can assign different surfaces and their sound qualities to it, whether it's diffusing, absorbing, or transmissive, and kind of create a 3-dimensional kind of space
Mhm.
that then you can set source and receiver positions to kind of simulate the effect of the actual room. So there's quite a few modeling software out there that can be used at a professional level to kind of determine before something is built how it's going to sound.
I see. And
Um,
for our guests, can you define those three surfaces that you could place on there? You said transmissive, you said reflective, you said
and diffusive,
diffusive. Thank you. Can you
right?
define what those mean?
So when it comes to any surface that you encounter, it could be sound reflective. So if you have a flat wall, then it's going to give you a very planar reflection back. And depending on what that surface is, if it's super heavy, it's going to give you a full frequency reflection from very low frequency bass to the high trebles. It's all going to
Mhm.
come back. If your wall surface is fairly lightweight, that reflectivity then changes. So maybe more high frequency reflection um, comes off of the surface. And some of the mid-frequency energy may be resonating with the wall. So it's being absorbed and dissipated through that movement in the wall, right? And some of the lower frequency sound is actually working its way through the material and being transmitted on the other side. So even a reflective surface can still transmit certain degree of energy. Now, you could purposely kind of introduce sound absorption. So this is hanging curtains or, putting acoustic wall panels on walls to kind of make the surface actually absorptive. And then this way you reduce the amount of reflections off the surface, or you can diffuse the sound. So if you put, how do I describe it? Like for instance, the pictures that are on the wall have deep frames. They're like 2-inch frames. That begins to break the plane and of the wall, and the reflections are now coming back at different times. So diffusion, if you see in a concert hall or a theater space, you might see it as pyramid diffusers that are stuck on a wall, or a recording studio. You see a lot of kind of different shapes on the wall. Those are meant to scatter sound. So
Awesome.
those are the things.
And so those treatments, those are the things that we mentioned, how sometimes you're involved from the very beginning of construction, sometimes you come at the very end, and sometimes I assume you're also doing um, upgrades or renovations or additional items after the whole building's been built, such as these acoustical treatments. Can you speak to us a bit about how important is it to hang those pyramid items or those panels on the wall? What do they like? What do they really what do they offer for these spaces, and how important are they?
So for instance, if you take like a rehearsal room where you have a bunch of musicians play in a small space before like they get on stage for a concert, right? The concert hall or the performance venue, which it's a proscenium theater, is usually much larger. There's a whole audience chamber for the sound energy to kind of expand. And the energy will kind of bounce around, dissipate, get absorbed in seats, get absorbed in people. But before they're on stage, they're usually in a smaller rehearsal environment. So if you can imagine just a plain simple box that's got all hard reflective surfaces, when all the musicians, whether instrumentalists or your singers, they go in there, sound is going to build up. It's going to be sustained in that environment. Now, maybe for 1 or 2 people in a smaller rehearsal space, that's probably fine. But let's say you get a full wind ensemble in there, or a big jazz band in there. The sustain of sound becomes so intense that it's begins to be difficult to hear, just because of all the sound that's bouncing around like crazy. And so the diffusion, the sound absorption, then allows, if you're strategically placed in a rehearsal space, then creates the environment where 50 piece wind ensemble in a rehearsal room can play without hearing protection. It's comfortable, right? They can hear all the details. They can hear across your section. Or if you're in a theater, you can communicate across, the performance area, and let's say there's a huge, instrument playback component to it. You can hear all the details and still be able to communicate across. So that's what the room treatments then enable the users to kind of be in a comfortable, safe, and a supportive environment. So that we could really focus on the art, right?
Yeah,
And not
exactly.
focus on like, it's like, wow,
What was
this
that?
is extremely loud. Yes. And
Yeah.
this is uncomfortable. Yep.
Awesome. Anthony, what's been your most exciting project to date?
Well, the one that pops at the top of my head is actually one that wasn't built.
Oh, wow.
It's
It was
the
so easy.
it's the Cypress Cultural Center.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
So I think maybe this is coming to my brain because it's very memorable. At that point in my career, this was in 2007, I think, when I started on this. Um, I had my son born in 2008. I was traveling to London to work with an international architect, with international other consultants. I had to learn a whole new building code system.
Oh.
That because every country, every location has a slightly different building code that you need to learn. Um, Different units of measurement, even. Just I
Yeah.
tell you, going from inches to centimeters or meters. Um, Everything about the project was just different.
Mm.
And maybe it was because of that overwhelming experience and just having also a very challenging design architect just say, hey, I don't like how that looks. Can you come up with some other options?
Ah.
It was probably the most challenging project that I've worked on. Um, and in that way, I think it was most exciting for me because when someone says, the three options you came up with, I don't like any of it. Can you come up with some
No.
more? Um, I think I learned a lot and got a lot from that experience, even though, the thing was never built, never realized.
Wow.
But the experience and the way that I approach problem solving, and just having to work a chance to work with, really cool architects and engineers that are kind of building things that haven't been done before,
Mhm.
was just very exciting to me, and hugely memorable.
That's all right. Yeah, I can imagine, you know, it doesn't look right the last three, but they need to do the exact same thing, just look different. I can see how that would be exciting and challenging at the same time.
Hmm.
So we got an anonymous attendee asking, have there been any especially strange requests from clients?
Let me think about that. Well, the strange request I would say is usually when we get involved early in design, we try to be upfront asking questions just to understand what is, the objective, right? What do you hope to see uh, come out of this project? And I ask that, of the architect. I ask the user or the owner. They may all have different perspectives, right, on what they hope to get out of the project. And if I can understand all the interests going in, then the acoustic solution, not just address what I think, would make a great project, but it is also responsive to all the different stakeholders and the people who are ultimately using it once it opens. Um, I guess the request that I would say is unusual is if someone wasn't involved in this design process and they later on ask something very simple like, hey, can you make this space do, you know, can you make this roadhouse? Will opera work in here? And this is like after you've been designing this for 9 months and it's ready to
Oh.
go out. It's like, let me think about that. So I think that the unusual request has been just kind of, we thought we had something figured out, and then something happens and a question or a program gets added. And how do you respond to that?
Oof.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know what you're talking about. I've never had a director on a show say, "Oh, by the way." So you did send a some pictures that Nikki Anderson Photography took of the Sonoma State University's concert space. I'd love to show it,
Sure.
particularly because it's beautiful. One first and foremost, but also it has an outdoor component. As you can see right here, I'd love for you to speak about this. This is from the stage, but also there we are outside. Did when you were designing this, did you have to take into account how the acoustics and how the environment would be for the outdoor participants as well as the indoor?
Yeah, absolutely. So this project is a really interesting one. It's a 1,400 seat concert hall that, yes, you can see the lower portion of the rear wall can open up and extend the seating from inside the hall to, a much larger lawn audience. I believe you could hold maybe 4,000 or more
Wow,
out there. So in a very kind of casual environment where you can see, the hills of the Sonoma
it's
area.
beautiful.
Yeah. um, and that everyone outside can share a similar kind of experience to folks who are inside the concert hall. And so there's almost like two projects. You have to kind of make sure that the acoustics of this 1,400 seat hall is absolutely dialed in. And here, this is just kind of a setup for a solo piano, but there's also been popular artists that has performed on the stage, and making sure that the room has banners and other things that can adapt the room to kind of different uses is kind of one challenge in itself. But what's interesting about this is that we had strategically located microphones throughout the house of this concert hall. Probably can't see it in these photos, but just imagine there's an array of microphones that's picking up sound as it kind of originates from the piano. If you can imagine a balloon expanding, right, bigger and bigger, and it touches all these surfaces of the concert hall, it'll engage these different microphones in different time and different reflection structure. And that's what really kind of gives the hall a particular sound at a particular seat, right? We took that information then and created loudspeakers for the lawn audience that then had the acoustic ambiance of the hall inside. Yes, so those are the loudspeakers that are on poles hidden by those trees. So we took the sound from inside the concert hall and played it back through these loudspeakers. There's also subwoofers that we put on along the edges to kind of really think about sound and all of its frequency range to create then a outdoor experience that has the richness, the reverberance of the concert hall. And what's a particular interesting area is if you sit close enough to the actual opening and the rear wall, you do get a blend of both the actual sound coming out the door into the lawn area, as well as then the reinforced sound from the loudspeakers, and trying to blend that so that it sounds very natural, right? That if you're looking through the portal on stage, it just feels like the flow of sound is natural to you, and you're not looking to the side. It's like, oh, okay, loudspeaker over there. I'm listening to something coming from 60 feet away to the side. So all that is part of kind of the overall planning of kind of the acoustics on the inside, and how do we think about taking that sound from indoors to outdoors.
Wow, that's a gorgeous space, and man, I've never seen anything like that where they've opened it up like that. It's really ingenious, actually. Awesome.
I probably should have said that was one of the most exciting projects, but
oh, there it is. There it
there
is.
it is. Yeah.
Well, and I'm sure that anyone in your position would say every seat's best, but when you walk away from a project, is there a seat in the house that you're like, this is the best seat? This is the best seat for hearing. Like, is it a different experience from a different seat within the house?
It is the different experience from the different seat in the house, just because just the physics, you can't keep all the surfaces equidistant from, your ears, and you have two of them, one on each side, right? So if you sit more to the house left side, then you're going to have reflections that come in closer in time from one side than the other. So the acoustic is going to be different. The objective is how to make it as best as possible, enjoyable as possible, right, from any different seat. And there's most definitely, in some halls, it's like, wow, this is where you got to sit, right? And what's exciting is that, if we did cookie stamp, performance venues, then it would be the same seat every single time. But because so much the design, shifts and kind of is shaped around the particular client or the performance group ensembles, that very rarely do we do two halls that are identical.
I see.
So then that spot does move around, and you have to, we plan for it to know where it is, where the sweet spot is. But, once we're there, it's always this kind of like, wow, experience. And I've been doing this 20 years.
Right there.
Yeah. And it still gets me every time. So
awesome. Yeah, our sound engineer, he talks about, yep, this is it. This is it. This is where I'm watching the show. And you've done things, outside of performance halls. I saw in some of the work that you do, you've done surgical rooms. Why is acoustics important for a surgical room?
That's a good question. We're always trying to figure out how to kind of create spaces that are very comfortable, that makes a very high energy, very kind of anxious, space or condition. And how do you kind of calm the person down, or the surgeon, or the staff that's supporting the surgeon, make them comfortable so they can really focus on what they need to do. Now, in a surgical suite, it's very complicated because there's so many requirements, from lighting to kind of the cleanliness of surfaces,
Mhm.
that we're very limited in terms of, what we can actually do to create a comfortable environment. And so one of the things that we focus on is that how can we create, the appropriate level of isolation? So, at least sound from adjacent spaces isn't coming into a space where people need to focus, right? Um, how do we create a background noise level that is not too noisy, where they can literally kind of think and communicate easily? um, that's where the acoustics come in.
I
We
see.
can't put any sound absorptive treatments in, because you can't clean it.
Yeah,
So, you know, then this is where we rely on all the technology, the lights, the apparatus, the equipment, to kind of diffuse sound,
I see.
and kind of create that. So it's a really kind of unusual acoustic design challenge of kind of trying to make that a comfortable space. But that's what I strive for, and you have to kind of draw on different things. Sometimes you're limited in what you can do, so the emphasis becomes sound isolation and mechanical noise control.
Well, I still love how it's always about the person and the end user in the room and what their needs are. That's awesome. Um, so you mentioned that you went to school for biology, and if you could tell any of our students that a class that you took that isn't necessarily related directly to your work today, but you found invaluable, that you look back and you say, "Man, I'm so glad I took that class." Is there a class that you would say, take this class? It's so worth it.
I would say it's actually probably some of the humanity classes that I had to take as part of the Common Core, because those classes, I think there's a lot of reading and writing involved, um, and there were a lot of asking why
Mm,
or how. And I think, if anything, from my undergraduate experience, it was more of this kind of just ask a lot of questions, make sure you really understand, what's going on, right? That's what I took away. I can't tell you any book that I read that I remembered, or yes, I aced that paper, right?
yeah.
But it was that actual process of like, do you believe what you just read, or is this credible? And so this is before even the web,
Mm,
where you're inundated with a whole bunch of stuff that you have to determine what's real and what's not. But this is just reading a book, and you are asked to take a position on it.
mm,
And that actually, I think, helped me later on, in even architecture class,
mhm.
where I'm drawing, I'm just kind of coming up with a design for a building. I asked myself, well, why should I do this over another option that I have? And it's kind of going through that motion of asking why, how, and what, you know, that then really helped me make better decisions as when I was going through architecture school. And I still draw upon it now. Like, I don't take any, just like, yeah, I've done that kind of project before. I still always go through and ask all the questions.
Ah,
um, and I think that's probably most beneficial.
okay, and well, and that may answer my next question, but I do have a question that I ask everyone towards the end. If you had one piece of advice for a student interested in your field, what would that piece of advice be?
I would say, really follow your passion. And I think that's ultimately why I decided, hey, acoustics is the thing for me, because I realized, after taking a really long and circuitous journey, that I'm actually pretty gung-ho about, acoustics and acoustic consulting, and making the, built environment a better experience for everyone. And I it's by following the passion that all the pieces then will align for
Mhm.
you in your own way and make you a unique consultant, right? It's not just like, here's the equation for it, go,
Yeah.
and you go do it. So I think if you follow your passion, if music is something that you're passionate about, if, theater, whether it's, the sound, sound design, or whether it's actually, the performance. But if there's this, desire to know more about, what is actually happening, the physics of it,
Hmm.
and you're interested in the built environment that you're in. So you don't have to be an architect, but you are aware of, wow, this is a beautiful room. It's got great light and I sound wonderful in here, right? Um, that kind of awareness is, and cultivating that, I think then enables you to become someone who may not have studied anything that was related to the field of acoustics, but then was able to pick up things along the way, um, to be a good consultant. So follow your passion and then connect the dots.
Love it. Love it. And I've got one more question for you. And I didn't prep you with this one, so forgive me. But as someone who has got a trained ear and knows about sound, what's your favorite kind of music to listen to? What do you play when you're testing out rooms or things like that?
Um, you always have to test something that you're familiar with, that you've heard a gazillion times, right?
Hmm.
And I was out in San Francisco doing some testing, and Taylor Swift um,
Oh no, my,
was
my
played.
8-year-old daughter plays it all the time, so I know
Yep,
all
and I think my kids might have influenced me on that. It's like, okay, I've heard of this a million times in the car, in the house,
about
and then it's like a sound that I know, and I can listen for, the beats, right?
it.
And it's like, okay, isolation's working. Wait a minute, I can't hear her vocals. Why is that?
Yeah.
Or it's not as clear. Um, so this,
Great. Well, it's always great to end on Taylor Swift, in the middle of an interview. That's great. So
that's right.
thank you, Anthony, so much for joining us. And thank you all for coming out and listening to Anthony SHOU, a acoustics consultant out of Houston. And I hope you and your family are stay safe. And thank you very much for joining us.
Great. Thanks for having me.
All
Thank
right.
you.
Take care, everyone.